Yeah, I really have no problem with the interruption. I'm doing very different kinds of workshops and teaching and so on in these Zoom contexts. So after a year, I'm super chill about anybody just jumping in. So yeah, I'll give a little science. I'm going to then take a break after the science part that's just more of a review. And I'm going to ask you some questions, or have you ask me some questions, so that I know whether to go to the second part that I could dive back into or not. So you'll know what I mean when I get there. Let me share my screen. All right, and thank you for coming. I know it's a really difficult decision to get on yet another Zoom call. So I find this really lovely. What a great show up of people. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. My students have told me I do this wrong because everybody can see everything else of mine, but whatever. Here we go. Okay. So just a little bit of a note around this effective optimism. I don't know a better word right now. I'm kind of jumping on the effective altruism, if anybody knows that term. Basically evidence-based ways of being optimistic about what we're doing, not just putting our head in the ground and hoping for the best. So this is kind of where we're going. We want to have, you know, as scientists, we probably all want to have really good data to base our parenting choices or research choices, all of that. The very bottom line is there's extremely poor data around this, never mind around the idea of parenting in the digital age in a pandemic. We have some interesting, you know, data from 1918, but most of us are probably not going to be caring that much about that relevancy. So that's a bit about the effective optimism. I just want to give you some reason to feel like there is reason, there is, you know, a good basis for having some optimistic trajectories in our children, given what they're going through. So first of all, this is just a basic slide with our own research, but also a lot of other people's research showing that our kids, not surprisingly, are online, and gaming in particular. 97% of kids are doing that. There's really nobody that's left out of this, and probably now it's 100%. This was just before the pandemic. And so the question is, what do we have as clinical or developmental psychologists to say about this digital context, especially now that they are so very immersed? So huge caveat, none of the data I'm going to show you, except, I'll ask if you want, except for the common sense surveys, have anything to do with this pandemic, because we haven't had enough time to study it, or study it in any kind of rigor where we can say this is actually about pandemic and not cohort, not the stress around, all sorts of other things, not about the digital thing. We may never, ever be able to disembed the stress around pandemic things versus the effect of screen time or screen use, right? So it's really important to keep that in mind with everything I'm going to tell you. What I can tell you is a little bit about video games, for example, that a lot of you might be worried about as parents, but also care about in terms of science. There, as you know, probably decades of research has gone into looking at the correlation and longitudinal association between video games and actual violence in the real world. The very bottom line is there's no relation. There's no reliable relation or any prediction between the games, first-person shooter games included, that kids play and any of their violent behavior. That is not to say that there are kids who have aggression problems that don't play video games that have violence in them. Of course, we know this as scientists, but in terms of causal relations, there is none. And there's 2 meta-analyses out there that you can easily Google that you'll find. This benefits of playing video games that we wrote now feels like way back when. I cannot believe it feels like almost 8 years ago anyway. Summarized all the data, but there's better and more recent meta-analyses that can give you all that data. If I go into common sense, so common sense, if you all don't know, if you're parents, you probably do know, but if you don't know, anything you want to know around most of the most popular digital media out there, Common Sense has done a really great job of, first of all, surveying all those things, getting parents to review those that content, and getting youth to also review it. And they tend to do good summaries, giving you a sense from my point of view, a little bit conservative sense of how much you have to worry about these content. But at least you understand the sort of descriptors and why they base their concerns around this. And as your kids get older, and my completely undocumented suggestion is to start sharing these common sense reviews with your kids. So my kids and I read, in fact, they actually ask for a game or a movie or whatever it is with the common sense review right underneath it, you know, basically claiming that they have read it and know that it's okay. So I would highly recommend it. Let me show you what they have found. And they are the only ones I know right now that have a reasonable chance of having some representative, completely survey data, right, around what's going on in the pandemic. So I would highly recommend you just do this yourself. I'm not going to read what's here, but if you go to commonsensemedia.org, they have a few recent reports that they have put up around what kids are doing right now. And so this one it happens to be one in Mexico. But it also has Japan, the US, and other kinds of countries that are answering representative samples to the degree that they can get them. And what they basically find is something you are not going to be surprised about. Both teens and parents feel like they're almost always on a digital device. They're checking, at least 50% of them say that teens and parents are checking their device several times per hour, that they are distracted by these mobile devices, both teens and parents. And I'm going to just keep saying this over and over again, because you'll finally get what my bottom line point is at the end of this talk, is that both parents and teens are distracted by their devices daily, or say they are. Both of them also agree that they have these benefits like staying in touch with extended family and most definitely learning tech skills online. This is like 91%. And I would say this is extremely relevant to all young people right now as they're in and out of lockdown and so on. Very importantly and interesting, across these countries, you get almost half of teens saying that they feel addicted to their mobile devices. I'm going to want to talk with you about what that means, because these are, of course, self-reports. And one very simplistic way of taking these data is to say, oh, our kids are addicted. Another is to say, we've done a really good job with our media to make sure that our kids feel like what they're doing is addiction. And they are reporting that really reliably. They spend, of course, what some of them feel, or many of them, or at least half of them feel like they spend too much time on their mobile devices. At the same time, 3/4 of parents and teens are saying that they are either improving their relationships or have made no difference in terms of their digital media. So this is really important on this flip side of it, right? If you go to the same site, I think this is really a great video that just highlights the relation between mental health and teens' use of digital devices during the pandemic. And it is a 5-minute video. I'll give you a tiny snippet of it so it gives you a flavor for it. And then I would just highly recommend you go there. They take their entire data set and then they have young people representing these.
I'd say 6 months ago that I was pretty much
school. Stress between school and extracurricular activities.
My mental health was better than it had been in a long time.
I was pretty happy most of the time.
I was just waiting to hear back from colleges, very excited, but
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
The coronavirus is a pandemic.
Many schools around the world, as you know, have shut down.
It's going to have a huge impact.
Right now, with the coronavirus and quarantine and everything, I'd say I've kind of retreated to a more isolated version of myself.
I definitely feel a little more frustrated and sad.
You start to worry about your future. You start to worry about, am I ever going to see my friends again?
I'd say especially in the months right before the virus, I was really branching out at my new school and making connections. But I do feel as if I've fallen back.
Just really not knowing how things are going to turn out and just rethinking your future and your life. And it really took a toll on me.
What's been worrying me the most during the pandemic has been getting sick or my family members getting sick.
Okay, so that's just to give you a feel for what, first of all, what common sense can give you in terms of snapshots and surveys, and also that this is really, we're just starting to get sort of qualitative interview data from young people and parents themselves around their experiences around there. What we knew before was that everybody was really, really worried. So the WHO, before the pandemic, included gaming addiction as a disease in their DSM. Or not their DSM, but their equivalent. A group of us wrote quite a few editorials and pulled our data to show that there's absolutely no evidence for this being a disease of any sort. But the WHO was very, very clear that they're going to categorize this as a disorder. And you got a whole lot of reports in the media, but also in terms of research, talking about, the relation between social media, not only games, but social media and depression, video game addiction, FOMO, and what it's doing for young people. So there was a lot, even before the pandemic, of concern, as you well all know. Smartphone addiction is killing us. This was the big one that made it for a while with, I just block her name out. Not that I have any issues with her. Wait, Twangy. And have smartphones destroyed a generation? This went super viral. She has now looked back at her data and changed her mind about this, but it was a really, really big deal, and still is for a lot of people, in terms of thinking that these smartphones are destroying a generation. I and many people, along with myself, who are doing research before the pandemic on the use of technology, use in developmental outcomes, really feel like this is exactly the same exact messaging that was happening with radio. Here's Journal of Pediatrics in 1941, children's reactions to movie horrors and radio crime. This has been done many, many times before. We have been concerned about the effect of media with our young people for generations, and it often sounds exactly the same in terms of tone. It's just, this is the rock and roll of our generation, our kids' generation. It's Fortnite, and it's games like Fortnite, or it's Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok. It is no longer Facebook. And so what we do know is, when we look across well-designed studies, so this is sort of a survey of well-designed studies from 2019 onwards. There is very little evidence for the causal relation between technology use and mental health outcomes. So many of these started to be the first diary studies where we tracked and we didn't have retrospective data anymore. Some of these started to be longitudinal studies, so they weren't only cross-sectional. They just started to emerge 2019 and later. And this is the latest review article that went through. Sorry, you can't really see this because of that. Let's put you guys upstairs. Okay. This paper just came out in 2020, last year, quite late last year. Amy Orban and Shablinski in that group at Oxford does incredible science work around, and methodology work and so on, around computers, digital screens, video games, and social media, and young people's development. Across 80 studies in this particular one, which is the last one, most of them, the big argument around the science is that they're almost all cross-sectional. They vary. When you take the ones that are longitudinal and that are well designed with reasonable control groups and so on, what you see is that there is a very small, like super small, overall negative impact of digital screen use and mental health outcomes. I can't emphasize how small it is. It's the same effect as glasses have on mental health. All right, so it's these effects that we need to have to think about what they mean, right? The message is much more in the variability. So the it's individual differences is basically what you see. You have huge variability, and that's why the effect size is so tiny. And we have no idea, and this is really important, none of these studies can speak to directionality. It is absolutely not clear and quite possible that it is those who have more mental health challenges that go to digital contexts to get support and help rather than the other way around, right? So that's really important. My hot take is we don't actually know anything scientifically yet, because none of the studies have been designed prospectively in a way that we can look at it. But my even hotter take is that it's the wrong question, because digital media right now is not what digital media was even 10 years ago or any other time before. It used to be leisure and entertainment. We now live, and are much more so, our young people live in a hybrid reality where their digital world and their physical offline world are indistinguishable in a lot of the most important contexts. In their social context, if you ask my 15-year-olds, who are your friends, they will never have said, oh, my online friend is in da-da-da, but my offline friend is whatever. Their friends are in one group. And this is really important, because also those friendship processes and the parenting processes and the socialization processes happen in this hybrid reality. So for example, if they are, when the pandemic's over, we have evidence before the pandemic that when young people would go to a party, they'd be taking pictures of each other and themselves and so on. They know, with the thought in mind, of course, that they would be posting them online. When they post that online, they get reactions that then go back to their offline school world where they're talking about it. And I'm talking about it as if I'm distinguishing these things. They are indistinguishable to these to young people, and they're only increasingly so. So the idea even of doing research on screen time, I would argue, is meaningless now. It's all around, and it's a ubiquitous. We can certainly, and what I think is really important, if I've set myself up for this, which I probably haven't, is to look at the context. So there are developmental science findings for 100 years that have told us what we do in terms of parenting with our kids. We know that warmth, restriction, boundaries, an authoritative style of parenting matters. And that's going to matter with the way that we think about technology use as well. And so what I want to do in these last 5 minutes is just give you a tiny flavor of what is out there that is just so different. The one thing, for example, is that we still, most of us, especially most of us who come from my generation or even millennials, still think of gaming in the context of a lone kid in their basement kind of thing, right? This is my kid 2 years ago. He was 12 at that point, and he looks like your typical, couch potato kid playing video games with a hole in his socks. And with a first-person shooter game. Actually, that he's not in first person at that moment, but he was playing it. But what you don't see as easily is that next to him is that phone, and the entire time it is on with 3 other friends, and they're talking. They're not talking about the game. They're talking I had the whole video of this whole thing. They're talking about girls. They're talking about the teachers they hate and love. They're talking while they're playing. They're in a playground, but they're socializing, okay? The other thing you don't see as easily is that this game is a super social one, where with a group of other people, are cooperatively strategizing to do things against other people who are also in a social context. The entire time they are texting with one another, communicating with other kinds of symbols so that they can get their goals met. This is an immensely social context. This is an unbelievably rich social information sort of matrix that they are constantly negotiating, right? And that's not what we see when we think about our physical world and what they're doing. So one of the things that's been really, really important to me is to just stop and listen a little bit more to what they're actually doing and what function these games and social media contexts are serving developmentally for young people. And they can talk about it if you actually spend a couple of more minutes asking, what are you actually doing in the game, and so on. If there's a rich amount of information that these young people are willing and excited to share with us if we would listen. The other thing that I really wanted to sort of emphasize is that there are different types of social games, and there are different types of co-playing that I think we underestimate as parents who may have not been brought up with parents who played games with us, especially digital games, right? So you have this sort of side-by-side kind of co-playing together. You have this is my father with my 2 boys, and I'd say 80% of their interaction used to be this kind of interaction, where he would literally be top down explaining a context that is a rich sort of, they couldn't quite catch up on the strategies, but they would be moving it around. They would be doing and there was a cooperative sort of emergent, absolute delightful, joyful experience, but all the partners were doing very different things to meet their own needs of connection. Then of course you have co-play in the same room, and then you have also playing. It's like Winnicott's idea of alone in the presence of the other, right? Or another, alone in the presence of another. You have each of you doing totally different things, but just having the other next to you, right? In the pandemic time, there's a lot of context where, of course, we have to be on Zoom and everybody has to shut up, or so that you don't hear each other. But there are other times where it might be really interesting to think about what is the effect of just being near one another in contexts that we are still immersed in what we have to do, work or play. We know from traditional parenting literature for literally a century, starting from Piaget and Vygotsky and others, that there's immense benefits of co-play between parents and children. There's emotional support that they get when they're really young. There's a sense of acceptance that becomes increasingly important as young people go into their tweens and teenage times, where there's just a sense of giving them an acceptance that what they love and do on an everyday basis is acceptable and also even celebrated by you as parents. There's a sense of trust that then can grow, predictability, control, and safety, and then cognitive scaffolding. Now, all of this comes from the non-digital context, but I would argue there's a lot of reasons to think that they're very similar functionally. And there's a new generation, sorry, this is kind of clipped off, of social games out there that are beautiful. They're pro-social. There's not a gun in sight. The entire point is to communicate either through gestures or other types of communications. And they are out there quite easily findable, and then also rateable. And I'm happy to share some. This happens to be Sky. It's a multiplayer, but also Journey and other kinds of games are out there ready to be played together. And so in this final thing where I want to open it up to you guys is to say, I really want to make sure that the message is that today's media landscape is social, absolutely at its core, and that there's different types of social that you can be playing. Couch, which is meaning side by side, online but social, or asynchronous, where you do something and then somebody does something later on. Cooperative and competitive processes, often coexisting in most games, but also in social media contexts, where you feel both the cooperativity of social groups, but also some competitiveness. And there are different impacts that we're going to find on mental health, depending on the functions that these types of environments are serving for young people and their developmental needs. And so here's just one, I'll just leave you with, for those of you who don't know Fortnite, this was the evil, right, of last year or the year before, and continues to be one of the most played games. Most of the other games that you will hear your kids being completely obsessed over are similarly, which are, God, my kids will kill me that I forget this because they play this almost every day. Anyway, there's other ones that are, as you get older, they're exactly the same. They're just a little more complex in strategy. But these are my kids a couple of years ago, and they would be horrified if they showed. Actually, I did get approval to show this part. What they are doing, and please try to forget my voice there. It's terrible. But what they are showing me is the dances that they learned in Fortnite. These are just kids in my backyard in the Netherlands, speaking Dutch. They all know each one of these dances. They had never practiced this before in their lives. They have no, together, ever. This is completely emergent. And I just was like, wait, I have to take a video of this. Do that again. So there's a lot we don't know around this hybrid reality is what I'm trying to say. Okay, hold on. So media's life now. It's not leisure, and there is no boundary and no simple boundary for youth right now. And I think we need a developmental lens to understand what's good and bad in that context. But we have a century of research and theory that certainly can point us to the right direction for new empirical studies. And also for what Patricia had said something about me having left the Netherlands. I'm actually leaving full-time academia to stay with one foot in science in part-time, but the other foot in trying to design new platforms and new apps that sort of take into consideration this century of developmental science and make context even more potentially fruitful for young people's development through that way. And I think scientists need to do a whole lot more this way. For those of you who are doing the basic science and the really good science, awesome. If you still love it and it still turns you on, awesome. I think there's a lot of us who are feeling frustrated with the rate of that science, and I would love to see a group of us caring enough to go back into the public and do something about changing the ecosystem that is corrosive at times. As parents, I think right now, I just want to, when I stop, I think we need to vent. We need to regulate our own emotions, by the way, around all of this frustrating stuff that's happening at the same time. And we need to self-reflect, because guess what we find in some of our own research, and I've collaborated with Tom Hollenstein at Queen's to do, he observed parents and children talking about their biggest conflict. Turned out that more than 50% of their conflicts were about technology use. That's not a surprise to any of us, but it was a surprise at that time. And when they talk about it, yeah, kids online time is a source of conflict. But equally is parents' online time. Equally is the phone we grab when we think they're not looking, or even when they are looking, and we know that. And it is an equal concern. So I think reflecting on our own use and the degree to which our own use might be actually way more corrosive than theirs, because they are learning right now how to partition their time in very different ways than what we learned, or at least I'm older than most of you, but we may actually be much worse at differentiating what's good and bad for us in our digital context than these young people are. They certainly have really good instincts around what's working for them and not. And so I think it's really hard to keep informed. Sorry, it isn't really hard to keep informed about what's going on out in that digital world, especially if we talk to young people. And I think if we're led by joy and connection and optimism rather than this fear and frustration, we have some really great places to go in terms of thinking about what online affordances can help and which ones can hinder our kids' development. So I'm going to stop now and take a sense of where everybody's at, and want to, I'll leave that there. Hold on, let me see how I'm going to do this. And I will stop sharing my screen and ask for your feedback and questions right now about what you're most interested in. I can open it up to my wild speculations of where we should and start thinking about doing research, but also with our parenting. I can also just listen to your concerns and try to have whatever data we have. I could try to speak to that. I can do a combination of that. I can talk about adolescent development and identity development, where we're going with that. It's up to you.
We have something in the comments.
Yes.
This is from Luika. She said, yes, some games that are more social. I would love to find some games that are not shooter games.
Yep.
Our older son is starting to ask for Minecraft, and we are hesitant because we feel he will retreat into himself and it will be difficult to bring him out of it and back to the physical world. He will turn 8 in June. I know that Minecraft is not necessarily violent, but there are builders and creative versions. I just feel very lost with this, as I have never played any video games. So if not screen time research, where should we lead? That's a follow-up.
Yes. Okay, so thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it represents many of our concerns. And when I started this, I was very, very much there. So first of all, I think that feeling of overwhelm of like, I don't know where to start. I'm not a gamer. I don't know what to say yes or no to is completely legit and terribly sad, because I could probably spend 15 minutes with you and you would feel totally like, well, okay, maybe you wouldn't. I'd spend an hour with you and you'd feel awesome. I could spend 15 minutes by just giving you information. It's not, if you go to Common Sense, you will know the kinds of games and other types of media, apps and so on, that are generally being talked about and very popular, and what's good and bad about it. And you as a parent with your own values can judge what and the extent to which you want your children to be involved in that. Secondarily, it's not about an all or nothing thing, right? So we still have screen time restrictions that are pretty hefty restrictions, not because there's any evidence that more time is worse for you, but because there's a bunch of things I want my kids to be doing. I want them to be, yes, playing outdoors, but I also want them to learn new stuff on music. Well, they're doing that online. That's great. I want them to read, but most of that is online, and sometimes that's audiobooks. That's okay. So for me, I think what happens with us getting overwhelmed is thinking that it's all or nothing. Like, oh my God, if I open the floodgates, that's it. He's going to be a gamer and a violent first-person shooter person, right? It's not. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be a negotiation with your kid, and not a negotiation. Meredith knows me well enough. When I say negotiation, you can kind of fake that, right? You can say, hey, you can have Minecraft, or you can have this other Roblox. Okay, these are two games you can have. Both of those games, by the way, you can find completely non-violent, no guns available. Roblox is another really big one that is huge out there, and there's a plethora of games within the Roblox world, just like in the Minecraft world. There's a plethora of games in there, and you can choose with your young person. You can say, hey, you've got one in each one of these that you can pick, and you can play a half an hour, or you can play an hour on Saturdays. That kind of basic parenting choice and opportunity to join with what they're excited about will get you so far, right? So that's.
Just wanted to interrupt. Meredith has her hand up.
Yes, Meredith, go.
Sorry, Isabella.
No.
Yeah, I just wanted to toss in sort of my own experience in my kid who's 13. And Minecraft is that, Isabel and I go way, way back. She knows my kid really well, and she is my like on the speed dial parenting expert who I've consulted many times. But with Minecraft, there's all kinds of co-creation that can happen with other kids in that virtual world. And so, you know, my son has a number of different friends where they've been building worlds together. And so, yeah, that's in, and my son's not into violent first-person shooter games at all. It's just not his thing. But that has become so much more like you're talking about is it's a social activity. You know, instead of actually handling blocks and building stuff, they're just doing it in a virtual world together.
Yeah. So that's a really, okay. So 3 really big things that Meredith brought up that I want to make sure that we all are on the same page. Most of this stuff is cooperative, not just competitive and evil. Second of all, yes, they build with blocks, but it doesn't mean that means that they don't actually end up physically building. There's a lot of context in which they bring the skills that they've learned in a virtual context into a physical context. And third, I'm really sorry to like break it to all of us, but this is the training that they require because their world will be digital. There is no going back. I mean, if I'm the first person to say this, it's really difficult for us, but this is literally the training they need to cooperate virtually in a virtual space, to build in virtual space, to communicate, to also self-regulate, to also put limits on themselves. All of these things they need to learn in a digital space. And I would suggest that our own lack of skill in that, because we weren't brought up in that context and therefore couldn't learn the muscle strength for that self-regulation, is being projected onto our kids, and we worry for them for things that we actually don't feel like we have control over. But they can learn that, and the only way they can learn that is in an immersed context where we can help them, by the way.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. What is the negative impact of, because we heard about negative impact of video games and technology on the kids, but what is the negative impact when you prevent your kid to grow with it? Because this is something that's gonna happen, and it's gonna happen, and it's happening. Nobody can stop.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
yeah.
What is the negative part of preventing your kid and restricting your kid so much that he or she doesn't have the opportunity to grow with the rest of the world in technology?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I would, my first answer is we don't know that much, but those studies that I showed you from the Orban group are doing a good job of showing some of the that there's not only no negative impact, but up to 3 or 4 hours in some digital contexts is a positive impact on people's mental health. And most of that, when you dig deeper, is around people feeling like they can share a world with their peers. If you take them out of that entirely, the social isolation and the feeling of not belonging is going to be, we already know that that's a huge risk factor for mental health. So of course it's difficult. Of course, as parents, we got to figure out where total immersion, where we feel like we've lost the ability to help our kids make decisions in digital context, is not where we want. So the same communication patterns, the same limit setting, and the same communication that's so important as they get into their teens to give them more and more autonomy is still important in the digital context as well. Yeah, so I think that's really, there was something else that brought up, but I kind of forgot.
While you're remembering, there's just a comment from Tanya, who says that there are internet contracts that you can have with your kids outlining your rules around it, and it helps.
Yeah. So there's great strategies and ways that people have already kind of come up with that you're going to have to figure out what fits your own parenting style and whatever. Like for me, that I really enjoy this kind of debate around these issues, and the fact that my kids can say, Mom, this is all about autonomy now. You haven't given me the autonomy. Like, there's some kind of delight in that. And there's also, my kids never touched Twitter until 2 months ago. And I finally let them do it because I had my own community that I felt like I can introduce them into. That community has now got my kids, people reading one of my kids' blog in the hundreds rather than in the 5 or 6 or 7 that he had his friends. And my other kid is creating music for people who are requesting stuff on Twitter, right? There is a way of onboarding kids in these contexts that, are about connection and joy and rather than sort of fear and frustration. Any other questions? Yeah.
Sawa,
I would want to ask that when you talk about Twitter, like I have a 13-year-old and she has amazing ideas and she always likes to talk about social issues. She just did a presentation on feminism, and when I read white feminism and when I read her speech, she scored a 97 on her public speaking. I was like, did you write this? Like, but I do not allow her on social media because just with this, the same fear that I will not be able to monitor her social media. So she's not on Instagram. And the only way I can control, I don't know, maybe it's just me being a bad parent or something. The limits never work for me. The only thing that works for me is the Bell app where I can just switch off their devices. And that's how I control it. Because it
so you're sharing a lot of our.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So limit setting is freaking hard, whether it was the digital age or not. It was always hard. It always has been hard. Figuring out how to start tapering that has always been hard. So it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. I would normally go right now to the developmental science, but given time, I just want to give you the simplest hack that actually works, no matter how sucky we are at like following through, which is give them a set of things that you want them to do. And if they do that, they get their time. I am very easily filled up 4 hours of my poor kids' time with their music practice and their half hour of reading and in their homework and their Rome database, blah, blah, blah. By the time they're done, I'm like, and then after that, if it's before dinner time, you get to do as much screen time as they want. I mean, they figured it out that they end up having a half an hour to an hour at most. So you don't have to make it into this, you can do it as a reward structure. And the reward structure actually is an amazing kind of, I'm all for sort of bribing my kids, but it works for a lot of parents that I've talked with.
All the time.
Yeah.
This is how we're parent all the time.
Use it for good, not evil. That's what I would try. Any other thoughts? I can go into something else that I'm afraid of freaking out, but on the other hand, I kind of am excited about as well, if there aren't any questions.
Doesn't look like it.
All right.
You can go ahead.
Let me do really quickly.
And if anyone does have anything else, just like throw it into the chat.
Exactly. Yes, thank you. I need you to be in all of my talks. That's an amazing.
Isabel, while you're getting that up, I'm just going to jump in and ask maybe if you'd be willing to share a list of the sort of nonviolent cooperative types of games with the group. I think that'd be really helpful. You've given me such amazing guidance over the years. I think lots of folks here could really benefit from that.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. The big caveat is that more and more I'm finding that every nonviolent game can be turned into, I'm going to say something really, really inappropriate, but I have to share this with you because it's like one of the most aha moments that I learned from designers, right? So when you work with designers, they have a thing called TTPs, and it's a duration of time, and it is time to penis. And that means that when they're designing any game, every kid, an adult, by the way, will mess around with a game context and will, in the most passive places, i.e. something like Journey, which has a beautiful sandscape or snowscape, there's going to be somebody who makes the silly little, penis, right? And so there is a point to this inappropriate insight, and that is that it is their job to mess with these systems. So I will tell you that Minecraft and Roblox and Journey and other games, and I can give you a list, but in each of these cases, I would say that more importantly is the discussion around how they're playing and why they're playing and what turns them on about a certain game, what doesn't. Because many of the games I thought were first-person shooter and awful are the ones that are strategically and communication-wise and social-wise beautiful examples of learning and social experiences, and yet they have a gun in front of them. Absolutely. So with that caveat, I'm happy to share that. So this is completely dataless, wild speculations, having immersed myself in the world of young people between 16 and 22 for the last 3 or so years. So we have youth advisory boards, and whenever we design our games that are, there for mental health impact or positive impact, we always have young people who are there co-designing with us. But we have these community of people who talk with us. And I feel like I've learned more that way than a lot of the data that we've collected, which is so much slower to come out. And some of the stuff that I'm learning really importantly is around I think that what's happening right now in the pandemic, there are, of course, awful things that people cannot see each other face to face. We all know that our kids aren't socializing, are not playing, are not roughhousing together, are not physically hugging, not having their first kisses or whatever, okay? Playing hide and seek, that sucks, okay? But I do think that a lot of the opportunity right now in online digital context is training them for a world in which they will be anyway living, which is one that is so digitally mediated that it's not mediation, it's just part of their world. And we can take this opportunity to figure out what works and what doesn't for each other. So for example, if this is teach your children well, sorry, you can see how old I am. The tools and mindsets around they themselves learning how to self-reflect about their time, about how they spend their time, and the intentionality with which they do that is really important, because one of the things these digital contexts do to all of us is make us less conscious. It's not the same as getting into a subway and going to another place and thinking about where you're going and prepping yourself and so on, when you can click and get totally into another context that kind of makes you feel, at least less anxious at that moment, right? So I think things like attention control, physical health, emotion regulation, and literally every interest that your kid might have in terms of science, music, dance, anything, history, archaeology, is online right now. And there's an amazing opportunity to sit alongside our children and learn with them, because we actually have to learn this ourselves. Things like attention controls. One of my kids really needs to learn how to stay focused, and he doesn't have good focus. And I've shown him how to use a Pomodoro. It's a stupid timer for 20 minutes. He then takes 5 minutes break, and then he goes back to 20 minutes, right? But it's a little timer. It's got an actual app, and it helps him, right? And it feels like he's still online, and he focuses better. There are timers and planners and all sorts of things like that. Physical health, you can really kind of hack with kids to make it more fun for them to use these things and think about their own physical health better, right? As they track their speed, as they track how long they've gone, how fast they've gone, et cetera. It's just fun to do it in these ways, and you can use technology for these things. Emotion regulation is an entire different thing, but you can learn through games, how to regulate your emotions and so on. And that benefits of video games review article that I showed you has some ideas of there, but there's lots more. And then with every interest online, what I want to do, so first of all, everything I've ever said is all because of these wonderful, wonderful people in my lab. None of the research I've really presented was our own, but still, these are the people that keep me sane and who I have been in digital touch with constantly during the pandemic. So I really want to thank them. And I want to just end with showing you, because don't ever say I didn't get practical. Here's one example, okay? This is, don't worry about Mr. Money Mustache. The guy's 15-year-old just quit school. Don't worry about that. But if you look at, I'll put it in the chat. Sorry, I'll put it in the chat. If you look at the bottom of his list, he is amazing for a lot of reasons, but his kid has decided to self-educate because it's a bloody waste of time what he's doing 6 hours a day when he's face-to-face with a lot of his teachers. And this is a list of just the most engaging and best quality. Khan Academy, most of you all know about, right? It has not just coding and math, it has every topic in there. But here's general science. Physics Girl is an awesome website. Thought Emporium, all of these websites, which you will now have access to once I put them in. This has nothing to do with me. It's just, you know, following people. Inventions and building stuff. This is all online. It is so fun. You're not going to want to go do your own work anymore. It's so interesting, so engaging. And sitting alongside your kid doing it is not going to feel like the chore that Minecraft used to feel like to me. That does not turn me on. Video creation, 3D animation, YouTubing strategies, coding and AI, math stuff, history and English stuff, music. So in all of these, I just want to give you that optimistic feel of just click on any of them and you'll say, whoa, there is such a great world. And you don't have to do it all on your own. You can let your kids with some limits go and self-explore each one of these. Pick one a week and say, here, before you get on your video game, you got to spend a half an hour on one of these sites, right? And tell me why, give me a 3-bullet answer of why you liked or didn't like it. That's for older kids, of course, but you know, it's that kind of approach that I think that parenting hacking right now could be really enjoyable for all of us. Okay, so I stop sharing. I will give you that link. And
I was wondering if you could comment on, thank you for the links. If you could comment on too much screen time and a link with like ADHD, for instance. Is there a link between giving my kid YouTube for literally hours at a time while I go do something else?
Nope. Nope. Not only that, make the YouTube content something that is just on this list and you will be like patting yourself on the back.
Thankfully, my son is really engaged in watching educational things, which then turn into activities that he does in the real world. Like I totally see that connection. He sees something online, he thinks, that's cool, I want to build that. And then he'll just shut it off and then he'll go try it himself. But
what's the question? That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's just like,
I mean, I literally mean that. Causally, there's no relationship.
Yeah. In the back of my mind, I remember hearing a lot about like, if you're going to give your kids a screen all the time, they're going to develop ADHD.
Nope. Nope. There's no causal relationship. Like we know that now.
I was hoping it was a lie.
Yeah.
I heard it. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's really pretty good evidence. Like a lot of people have been trying to find that link. And if it was there, and a lot of people find it quite the opposite, that they can now that we can respect people's different sort of attention styles, people are putting on music while they're doing their math or other kinds of, Meredith can probably speak to that because we've talked about attentional styles all the time. And now we have those affordances that we can maybe help kids actually work with their attentional styles better. Yeah, Meredith.
I just wanted to comment too. My own experience with my own kid is, you know, being concerned about attention regulation and watching him negotiating multiple different sort of channels at the same time. You know, I might look at that and say, oh, this looks like attention deficit. And it's no, he's on it with each of these different channels. And that's actually a really remarkable skill as I look at that, developing him, this capacity to, you know, like Isabel's boys, be online, playing a game, talking to his friends, managing that chat, and at the same time answering questions from me about when are you going to come and help me grate the cheese for dinner. You know, he's able to do all of those things because he's interacting now in a world that affords him the opportunity to sort of build that muscle of attentional switching and control, which I think is only going to benefit him in the future. I mean, if I saw it having if it was having a negative impact, of course I would intervene, but I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, and just to wrap that point up, because I think it's a really important one. That is it, Brooke, or are you just?
Oh, it's Brooke. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
You can probably see on my name tag. That's
because otherwise you're women in science.
Yeah.
You know, I think the other thing is we forget that our parenting matters, but it also matters only to some degree. I have twin boys, and they're using their digital context extremely differently. So it's again the question of causality and whether the use of screens is causing their attentional problems, or the other way around, that their attentional problems are being managed in a different way because they need something different, is really important.
Okay, great. That kind of put to rest this back of my mind fear, being like, is this going to lead to something bad down the road? But I do see him using it in a very productive way, which is why I don't want to take it away from him. He's very responsible. He's only 5, but he really responds very well to it. I see a lot of creativity come out of it.
But
Salva, you have talking about it. Salva, I want to hear your point, but I think the thing to keep coming back to is you can allow for a certain thing and say, we're going to check in on this next week, right? We're going to figure out, do you still feel it? Fortnite for a while actually made my kids in a bratty mood for 15 minutes afterwards. It went away. There's no long-term impact, but they were bratty, and I was like, you're getting off of this if you're going to be bratty. You better start massaging my feet after Fortnite, or you're off of it, right? And they can reflect on these things and how it impacts on their mood. So sorry.
Yeah, I just have one last question. Is there a right age for giving your children social media or not? Because I hear that from a lot of parents who have older kids, and they keep telling me, do not give a cellular phone to your child as long as you can't. So is there any evidence or is there a right age for that or not?
Yeah, the data, there is no data for you. I would think about the balance that you have around helping your kid and training your kid to know how to regulate their lives in this hybrid reality that they live in, period. Whether you will allow for that instrument or not, they will go to their friends, they will be in school, and all of that stuff is going to be happening anyway. So when do you allow, there's two things. It's your own guilt. And so I think your own guilt could be really helped by just joining with them and saying, so what are we going to use this thing for? Because here are the 3 things I'm most concerned about. And they will hear you, right? So I think that helps with your own guilt. And then there is a level of thinking about what those contexts are. Like Twitter, I'm not letting my 10-year-old, but that's because there's a lot of free talk that they can have access to that I wouldn't have wanted them to be walking into a pub either at that age, right? So I think it's those kinds of questions you want to ask yourself. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all. This has been a really great time. I know we can all chat.
That's a super conversation, even for very young kids. Like I have 2 grandchildren that they just 1 year old, and the parents sometimes, oh, don't give your cell phone for them, but they so natural. They do stuff in their phone that I don't do. Like, how did you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's so many things to talk about that, but the fact that they are joyful near you and you feel, or you can take 15 minutes off and take a shower and or call a friend and be on your own. I don't know if you're going to, balance that mental health, benefit of being a good, more chilled out parent. I think it's really important to keep that in the mix.
This is all very positive.
That was
I think we're all very grateful to hear an expert say these things and echo.
Yes, it is.
Oh my God, you have reduced our guilt to 75%. Seriously.
Honestly, thank you. That's awesome. And it's still hard, but that's really nice to hear. Really.
You're getting applause from people in the audience now.
Thank you all, really.
Have more questions?
Hi, Tom. Hi, Tom. Thank you for coming. You don't even have kids, and you're a boy, and you're coming to the
Our group is open to anyone. It's just presented by women in science, but it's for everyone. Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining, Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is, we're running like just on time here, and I don't think if we have more questions, we want to say very much, like, thank you so much for invite. Thank you, Merida, for the suggestion. This topic appeared in our last meeting in January. We started to talk about being busy parents. Actually, I think it was a conversation between Merida and Brooke about Brooke mentioned that she feel guilt about letting her kids.
It was my work from home situation was
and then son of the gun, everybody in the room stopped to talk what we were talking before and talk, I feel guilty too. And then Mary said, I have a good person to talk with us.
I literally, as my two friends here will say, my entire life is guilt. So, and I feel way more guilty about the get off, I'm on, get off, I'm on, than a lot of the other parenting stuff that I'm letting go. Is like the idea of constantly shooing them out of my space just feels awful. So yes, I hear you all.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been great. We're probably going to post this onto a YouTube channel if that's okay with you, so that other people can read and or listen and enjoy this talk.
Please share the link of the YouTube, Brooke. I would like to share it with a lot of friends.
Yeah,
thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And this is a weird thing for me to say because I'm 51, but I do my Twitter handle. If you follow, that's where I post a lot of the parenting science when it does come out. So it's, let me just put it in here at Play Nice Inst.